Have you ever heard a story so unbelievable it makes you question everything you thought you knew about survival? Because what I'm about to tell you starts with a mother who lost everything: her home, her job, her safety, and ended with her uncovering a Cold War secret the U.S. government spent 57 years trying to erase. In a country where over 1.6 million Americans experience homelessness each year, she was just another invisible statistic until the day she opened a rusted hatch in the mountains of Montana and stepped into a bunker filled with evidence, wealth, and danger no ordinary person should ever touch. And the craziest part, the fortune buried inside wasn't the real secret. The program behind it was. So the question is, what would you do if you stumbled onto something the government would do anything to get back? Let's step into the darkness together. The story starts now. They say most American families are just one crisis away from losing everything, but Mara Ellison never imagined she would become one of those statistics. Not her. Not the woman who once budgeted every dollar down to the cent, who kept 3 kids fed, clothed, and loved on a salary that barely scraped middle class. But collapse rarely happens like a thunderstorm. It comes like a slow leak in the roof until the whole ceiling caves in. It began the year her husband walked out without warning. No explanation, no apology, just a text message at 5:17 a.m. that said he needed quiet, needed space. A sentence so painfully vague it felt like a bruise she couldn't name. He emptied half their joint account, leaving her with $614.37 and 3 children who woke up asking why Dad's car wasn't in the driveway. Studies say the leading cause of homelessness for single mothers is a sudden family breakup, and Mara found herself becoming a quiet point on that invisible graph. She lost her job next. The small medical billing office she'd worked at for 7 years shut down when the owner retired early. Corporate consolidation, they told her, nothing personal. But it felt personal. Everything did. When she applied for help, rental assistance, food stamps, emergency child care, every office gave her the same sentence, spoken in different tones. We're backed up. Please be patient. It's hard to be patient when you're rationing cereal so your kids can each have half a bowl. The eviction came in a white envelope taped to her door. She had 30 days. 30 days to pack up the life she'd spent a decade building. Statistically, single mothers are the fastest growing homeless population in the U.S. But numbers don't capture the humiliation of standing in an apartment doorway wondering which belongings your children will miss the least. Mara donated half their clothes, boxed their memories, and on the 31st day loaded everything into her old Dodge Caravan, the paint peeling like scabs on wounded metal. Life inside a car isn't like movies make it seem. There's no dramatic music, no heroic turning point. There's just the smell of stale air, the ache in your back, the fear every time someone walks too close. She rotated between Walmart lots, interstate rest stops, and the back corner of a church parking lot, where the pastor pretended not to notice them. At night she kept the keys in her hand, ready to start the engine at the slightest threat. Her youngest, Lily, slept, curled against her stomach, like she was trying to melt into her. Her son, Noah, barely spoke anymore, and her oldest, Grace, 12, going on 40, watched Mara the way abandoned dogs watch strangers, hopeful but bracing for disappointment. There were moments when Mara broke in, ways no one saw, like the night it snowed in late April and she covered the kids with every blanket they owned, then sat awake until dawn, blowing warm air into her hands, just so she could press them against her children's cheeks to keep them from shivering. Or the day she stood in line at a food bank and overheard two women whispering about irresponsible moms who have too many kids. She wanted to scream that she hadn't chosen any of this, but shame held her tongue hostage. Some nights, she imagined driving her children to her sister's house 3 states away, leaving them at the door with a note explaining everything. Not because she didn't love them, but because she did. Because she thought maybe love wasn't enough. Maybe someone else could do better. But she never started the engine. Instead, she survived the way American mothers always have, by stitching hope out of thin air. The breaking point came one morning when Mara checked her bank account and saw $42.19. Gas was at a quarter tank. The kids were hungry, and she was out of answers. She sat in the driver's seat, hands shaking so hard she could hardly unlock her phone. She wasn't looking for miracles anymore, just a sign she wasn't invisible. And that's when the email arrived. A subject line that felt like it came from someone else's life. Notice of inheritance. Immediate response requested. For a moment she laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. She'd been scammed before, but something made her open it. Maybe intuition, maybe exhaustion, maybe fate. A name she hadn't heard since childhood stared back at her. Elias Crichton, a grandfather's cousin she barely remembered. A family ghost no one talked about. Deceased. Property left in her name. Immediate attention required. She read the email 3 times, pulse pounding, as her kids stirred awake in the back seat. Mara didn't know yet that this message would unravel secrets buried for half a century, that it would drag her into a world of hidden bunkers, government programs erased from history, and a fortune hidden underground. All she knew in that moment was that something had shifted, something had cracked the darkness, and though she didn't realize it yet, her entire life was about to change. Now, as the cold morning light crept across the windshield of that old Dodge Caravan, Mara took a breath that felt like the first full inhale she'd had in years, and turned the key in the ignition. Because sometimes the road out of collapse starts with a single, impossible message. For most people, an unexpected email from a law office feels like an annoyance. But for Mara, sitting in a parking lot, her entire world reduced to the few objects packed into the back of a fading minivan, this email didn't feel like spam. It felt like a hand reaching through time, tapping her shoulder, almost as if someone somewhere still remembered she existed. She read it again, slowly this time, tasting each word like medicine she wasn't sure she trusted. You have been named as the sole beneficiary in the estate of Mr. Elias Crichton. The name shuddered loose a long-buried memory, a family barbecue when she was maybe 9. Her mother whispering about Elias, the way people whisper about weather that ruins crops, something unsettling, something unpredictable. He was the strange one, the man who vanished into the mountains during the Cold War, convinced the government was lying about what was coming. Someone who built things underground, someone who refused to come home. Families don't talk about their ghosts. They hide them under polite smiles and holiday traditions. Mara never asked about him again. She hesitated before calling the number. Scam? Probably. But scams didn't usually include the exact spelling of her legal name or mention a relative she barely remembered. And when you have nothing left, hope becomes dangerous. But ignoring it feels even worse. She pressed the call button. A woman answered with crisp professionalism. Benton and Mark's Legal Services. How may I direct your call? When Mara gave her name, there was a pause, long enough for a pulse of dread to rise in her throat. Please hold for Mr. Marks. He's been trying to reach you. Trying to reach her. People didn't try to reach her anymore, not for months. When the lawyer came on, his voice sounded older, heavy with the weight of delivering truths. Families don't share. Ms. Ellison, I'm handling the estate of your late relative, Mr. Elias Crichton. I understand this may come as a surprise. Shock didn't cover what she felt. More like vertigo. More like being handed a map to a place she didn't know she needed to go. What exactly did he leave me? A property, Mr. Marks said. Remote, undeveloped. He lived there alone for nearly 40 years. He paused. And a message. A very specific message, intended only for his heir. A message? For her? From a man who hadn't spoken to his own family in decades? For a moment, she said nothing. The kids were stirring behind her, stretching under blankets stiff from cold nights. Lily blinked up at her with sleepy confusion. Noah rubbed his eyes, already asking if they'd have breakfast today. Mara swallowed hard. Why me? Why not someone closer to him? You are the only surviving relative he named, the lawyer said gently. And he was very clear. Clear. A man who lived in the woods for 40 years had been clear. Her voice trembled. What did the message say? The lawyer inhaled softly, like he was bracing for her reaction. He wrote, If she is reading this, then her world is collapsing. Tell her the shelter is hers now, and tell her not to make the same mistake I did. Mara froze. Her world was collapsing, not metaphorically, literally. She was living out of a vehicle, rationing peanut butter sandwiches, counting quarters for gas. He'd predicted her situation with eerie precision decades before she was even born. How did he know? She whispered. Ms. Ellison, Elias believed the world ran in cycles. Economic collapses, political unrest, natural disasters. He prepared for the worst. Maybe he believed someone in the family would one day face what he feared. Prepared. Shelters. The man who disappeared during the Cold War wasn't running from people. He was running from prophecy. The lawyer gave her the address, a tiny town she'd never heard of, tucked near the Rocky Mountain foothills, a place whose population was small enough to fit in a high school gym. He told her she needed to come sign papers, bring ID, simple enough, standard estate procedure. But nothing about this felt standard. When the call ended, the silence inside the van felt heavier than ever, like the air thickened with questions that didn't have answers. Grace, always the observer, finally spoke. Mom, are we in trouble? No, Mara whispered. Maybe the opposite. But even as she said it, she wasn't sure. Hope made her cautious now. Hope could betray you worse than hunger. Yet, beneath the fear, something new stirred. Something that felt almost like direction, like purpose, like a tiny flame flickering stubbornly in a dark cave. That day, after scraping together enough money for gas and cheap breakfast sandwiches, she told the kids they were going on a drive, a long one, but not away from something this time, towards something. As the minivan rumbled down the highway, the landscape stretching into endless miles of open road, she felt the strange weight of Elias's message sitting inside her chest. A man she never knew had left her a warning, a burden, maybe even a lifeline. And while she didn't know it yet, that message was the first thread in a tangled web of secrets, a web stretching back to government operations no one was supposed to know existed, a web she was about to step into whether she was ready or not. Because some messages don't just reach across time. They pull you forward into a future you never expected. The highway out of Denver stretched long and empty, the kind of road that made you feel small, like the world could swallow you whole if it wanted to. Mara's old minivan shuddered with every incline, the engine coughing in protest as though it too knew they were heading somewhere people didn't come back from. The kids had fallen quiet, not asleep, but sunk into a kind of stillness children learn when life has already taught them too much. Outside the windows, the landscape changed from glass towers to forgotten towns, then to wide, lonely plains, broken only by barbed wire fences, and the occasional gas station that looked like it hadn't updated its prices since the 90s. There's a strange silence that exists in rural America, a quiet that feels dense, almost historical, like it remembers things people forgot. As they drove deeper into that quiet, Mara felt a tension build behind her ribs. She didn't know if it was fear or the fragile outline of hope she didn't dare name yet. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Every 30 minutes, she checked the rearview mirror, not for traffic, but to make sure each of her kids was still there, still breathing, still hers. 2 hours in, the GPS lost service. When the voice cut out mid-sentence, the sudden absence felt like a warning. They drove the last 40 miles guided only by memory, her own and the lawyer's handwritten directions scribbled on the back of an invoice. Small towns appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Some had boarded up diners. Others had churches with signs reading, "Revival tonight," or "We're praying for rain." They passed houses with peeling paint and rusted swing sets, the kind of places where people didn't dream of becoming astronauts or CEOs. They dreamt of paying the bills on time and keeping the farm another year. And the kids sensed it too. Grace pressed her forehead to the glass, tracing the outlines of falling apart barns and lone mailboxes, leaning like tired old men. "Do people really live out here?" she whispered. "Some do," Mara said softly. "Some choose it, some don't have anywhere else." The road narrowed until it wasn't really a road anymore, more a strip of dirt that wound up into the foothills like a scar across the land. Dust rose behind them in a long, pale tail. The trees grew denser, blocking out the sun in patches. When the minivan finally wheezed its way into the clearing, it felt less like arriving at a destination and more like slipping into someone else's abandoned nightmare. The cabin was the first thing they saw, small, leaning, its windows fogged with dust like tired eyes. The kind of place a horror movie wouldn't bother using because it looked too predictable. But the kids stayed close, unsure if they were supposed to be scared or relieved. Then they saw it. A concrete slab in the ground, 10 feet across, flat, colorless, and in the center, a steel hatch with a wheel lock that hadn't been touched in years. The air seemed to thicken. Even the birds stopped singing. Is that it?" Noah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mara stepped toward it slowly, like the ground might crack beneath her. The metal was cold beneath her fingertips. Real. Heavy. It felt like touching history, or danger, or both. For a moment she wasn't in a clearing. She was standing in every fear she'd ever carried, being alone, being powerless, being responsible for lives she couldn't save. The hatch was all of it, but she couldn't step back, not when this might be their way out. She turned the key. The lock groaned, dust falling like gray snowflakes. When she pulled the wheel, it resisted, as though something on the other side wanted to stay closed. But she pushed harder, and eventually, with a scream of old metal, the hatch lifted. Darkness yawned beneath them. A ladder disappeared into it like a throat. Even the breeze felt colder now. There's a moment in every survivor's story when they cross a line that changes everything, when fear becomes a doorway instead of a wall. For Mara, this was that doorway. She turned to the kids, forced a smile she didn't feel. "Stay up here. I'll check first." "No, Mom," Grace protested, grabbing her sleeve. "It looks—" "I know. Please be careful." "I will." Mara stepped onto the ladder. Descending felt like sinking through time. Each rung echoed up the walls. Dust drifted through the beam of her cheap flashlight, swirling in patterns like trapped stars. The farther she went, the colder it got. Colder than any basement she'd ever known. Colder than the freezing nights in the minivan. When her foot touched concrete, she felt the temperature shift again. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It felt intentional, like something preserved, protected, untouched for decades. And then her beam found the door. 6 inches of reinforced steel. A blast door, with a second lock waiting for the second key in her pocket. Her breath trembled. God, Elias, what were you hiding down here? She inserted the key. It turned. The hinges sighed open, and the bunker exhaled. The smell was stale but clean, as if everything inside had been sealed away from time. Shelves, supplies, a cot, a lantern, books arranged in a neat row, a small table with a mug still sitting on it, as though Elias had taken a sip one morning and simply never returned. It wasn't horror, it wasn't chaos, it was lived in, maintained, almost welcoming. Mara took a step inside, feeling an unexpected wave of relief wash over her, not because it was beautiful, but because it was safe. In a world where she'd had nothing but instability for months, this small, dust-covered room felt unconditionally solid. She didn't know yet that this was only the outer shell, that what lay deeper in the bunker would upend the last fragile pieces of her understanding. She didn't know that Elias's message was only the beginning of a larger truth, one built on secrets, surveillance, and government operations scraped from history books. But in that first moment underground, surrounded by silence thick as stone, Mara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A beginning. She climbed back up the ladder to bring the kids down, not realizing that with each step she was descending into a mystery that would haunt the next chapter of her life. A descent into history. A descent into danger. A descent into the truth. The moment Mara led her children down the ladder, the air changed. It wasn't just colder, it was heavier, like the bunker remembered every footstep it had ever carried, like it had been holding its breath for 40 years, waiting for someone, waiting for her. The lantern flickered weakly as they reached the bottom, casting long shadows that trembled along the concrete walls. Lily clung to her mother's coat. Noah stepped carefully like the floor might crack beneath him. And Grace scanned every corner the way a child who'd grown up too fast naturally does, checking exits, reading silence like a second language. What they saw didn't look dangerous. It looked meticulous. Shelves lined the main room from floor to ceiling. Rows of canned goods, water jugs, first aid supplies, tools, notebooks, lantern fuel, batteries sorted by size, all arranged with mathematical precision. It was order in its purest form, the kind of order that only comes from a man who feared chaos more than loneliness. Was he living down here? Noah whispered. Mara nodded slowly. For a long time, baby. There was a small kitchen area, just a propane stove, an enamel pot, some mismatched utensils, a cot pushed into the corner, its blanket folded with military neatness, a desk covered in notebooks, and everywhere the feeling of a life paused in mid-sentence. She ran her hand over one of the notebooks, surprised by how steady her fingers felt. Elias's handwriting was small, clean, unwavering. One page described maintenance routines for the ventilation system. Another recorded the dates he'd checked radiation meters, years and years of readings that showed nothing out of the ordinary. But then there were entries that drifted into something heavier. Most people prepare for storms they can see. I prepare for storms I can feel. The world above forgets quickly. Down here, forgetting feels like death. If anyone ever finds this place, may they use it better than I did. Grace read over her shoulder. Mom, was he scared? Mara closed the notebook gently. Maybe. Or maybe he was just alone. Fear and loneliness can look the same when written on paper. The kids explored cautiously at first. Noah inspected canned peaches as if they were treasure. Lily found a wooden toy truck hidden beneath a crate, untouched and covered in dust, as though Elias had once thought a child might visit. Grace stood near the desk, her hand hovering over a compass, her eyes filled with quiet questions she didn't know how to ask. There's something almost sacred about stepping into the space where someone poured out their fear, their hope, their entire existence. Mara felt it deep in her bones. This bunker wasn't madness. It wasn't paranoia. It was the last attempt of a man trying to build safety in a world that never offered him any. She examined the ventilation unit next, a bulky steel pipe cut into the concrete wall, humming faintly with air. Circulation. He kept this running, she murmured, for decades. It struck her then how impossible that must have felt for him, maintaining everything alone, knowing no one was coming to help him, knowing that if something broke, it was up to him to fix it or die trying. And yet, he had done it. Every bolt tightened, every filter changed, every record kept. It was a lesson she absorbed without words. Security isn't built in a day. It's built in patience, discipline, and a willingness to face problems before they arrive. The bunker had power too, limited but functional. A generator sat in its own small alcove, surrounded by fuel cans, sealed tightly with handwritten dates. She tugged the cord once, twice, and with a reluctant roar, the bunker bloomed with light. Real electric light. Lily shrieked with delighted surprise. Noah laughed. Even Grace cracked a smile. For the first time in months, Mara felt her shoulders lower from their defensive height. She couldn't call this home. Not yet. But it was safety in a way she hadn't felt in so long. She barely remembered what it felt like. Still, something tugged at her. A quiet wrongness. An unfinished sentence. The far wall caught her attention. At first it looked solid, nothing but poured concrete and metal supports. But beneath the lantern glow, there was a faint outline, a seam, a subtle shift in texture, like someone had covered something they didn't want found. Mom, Grace followed her gaze. What is that? Mara stepped closer, running her hand along the wall. The cold against her palm was sharper there, deliberate. She pressed lightly. Nothing. But when she tapped it, the sound was off. Hollow. A hidden door. Her pulse quickened. She'd already learned that Elias wasn't the kind of man who left things half-finished. If he built a secret room, it wasn't decorative. She pushed. Nothing. She searched for a latch, a hinge, anything, but found only smooth metal painted to mimic concrete. Her fingers brushed dust away from a corner, revealing the faintest shape of a handle concealed under a panel. Step back. Her children moved behind her instinctively. She gripped the handle and pulled. It didn't budge. She pulled harder, her muscles straining, dust raining from above. Something deep within the wall gave a low groan, like an old giant waking. With one final wrench, the panel scraped open an inch, just enough for cold, stale air to escape, like a breath held for too many winters. Lily whimpered. Grace whispered, "Mom, maybe we shouldn't." Mara didn't answer, because she wasn't sure, because part of her wanted to close it again and pretend she hadn't seen anything. But another part, a deeper, quieter part, knew that if Elias had gone to this length to hide something, she had to know what it was. But not now, not yet, not with the kids trembling behind her and her own heart pounding like a warning bell. She pushed the panel back into place. "We'll come back to this," she said softly, "one step at a time." And that became the lesson in her mind as she tucked her children into makeshift beds that night. Not every door should be opened immediately. Some require preparation, courage, and the right moment. As the bunker lights dimmed and the generator hummed, Mara lay awake, staring at the outline of that hidden door. She had shelter now, food, water, a chance to breathe. But behind that wall sat something Elias had protected with almost religious devotion. Something not meant for the world outside. Something not meant for just anyone. Something meant for her. And when she finally opened it, her entire understanding of who Elias was and what he was protecting would shift forever. For 2 days, Mara pretended the sealed wall didn't exist. She kept herself busy with the small practical rituals of survival, sorting supplies, checking expiration dates on canned goods, cleaning the dust from every corner of the bunker, as if polishing a forgotten life could somehow make her own feel less fractured. The kids adjusted faster than she did. Lily made a nest of blankets and claimed it as her underground castle. Noah treated the old radio like a treasure from a pirate ship, even though it didn't pick up a single station. And Grace, always the observer, hovered between wonder and unease, her eyes flicking toward that hidden seam in the wall whenever she thought her mother wasn't looking. But secrets don't sit quietly forever. They press against the edges of your mind like water behind a cracked dam. And for Mara, who had spent so much of her life running from fear, this was the first time fear wasn't outside. It was built into the walls. On the 3rd morning, she couldn't avoid it anymore. While the kids played quietly near the cot, she approached the wall with a toolbox she'd found tucked beneath Elias's desk. Each step felt heavy, like she was walking toward something that already knew her name. She touched the seam again. It was colder than the rest of the room. Too cold. She pulled the concealed handle. This time, she didn't stop when it resisted. She braced her feet, gritted her teeth, and pulled with the strength of a mother who had carried the weight of the world alone for far too long. The panel scraped open another inch, then another. Dust exploding into the air like old memories finally being disturbed. And then, with a long metallic sigh, the hidden door swung open. A freezing gust of air rushed out, carrying the scent of metal, paper, and something older, something untouched by daylight for decades. The flashlight beam trembled in her hand as she stepped inside. The chamber was larger than she expected, maybe 30 feet long, narrow, and carved directly into the earth like a rib pulled from the mountain itself. Shelves lined the walls, but not with food or tools. Instead, hundreds of small wooden boxes sat stacked in perfect rows, each marked with coded numbers and metal tags. The floor was iron-grated, the ceiling reinforced with steel beams. This wasn't a living space. It was a vault meant to hide something dangerous. She opened the nearest box. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a bar of gold, heavy, pure, the kind miners used to risk their lives for. Another box held silver coins stamped with dates from wars long since ended. Another, foreign currency sealed in airtight bags. And another, her breath caught, contained bearer bonds worth thousands of dollars each. Untraceable, unclaimed. The kind of financial instruments that, in the wrong hands, could crumble systems. Her mind reeled. Elias wasn't just preparing for his own survival. He was protecting something, or keeping something from being found. But the deeper she moved into the chamber, the stranger the collection became. Files stamped with government seals, maps marked with red circles and coordinates, charts detailing old Cold War simulations, attack vectors, fallout patterns, relocation zones. And then, on a metal table bolted to the floor, she found something that made her hand tremble as she picked it up. A dossier stamped with an emblem she didn't recognize. A code, ER-17. And beneath it, a phrase typed in cold, utilitarian font, Emergency Asset Relocation, Civilian Custodian Protocol. She whispered the words, barely believing them. Civilian Custodian. Assets. Relocation. "What is this?" Grace murmured, from behind her, startling her. The girl stood in the doorway, wide-eyed, her voice soft with awe and fear. Why did he have all this? Mara didn't answer, not because she didn't want to protect her daughter, but because she genuinely didn't know. Everything she touched raised 10 new questions. The documents felt too official to be a conspiracy. The money felt too real to be a delusion. And Elias. Elias felt too forgotten to be a villain. She reached for a notebook, laid neatly beside the dossier. Elias's handwriting again. Steady, sharp. If you are reading this, you must decide whether these assets remain buried or return to the hands that abandoned them. They trusted me once. They should not have. I kept the promise they never intended to honor. Mara closed the notebook, her heart pounding. The air felt thinner. This wasn't simply survivalism. It wasn't paranoia. It was intention, purpose. A responsibility he had carried in silence, and now that silence belonged to her. She scanned the room again, noticing small details she had overlooked, the coldness of the air that suggested a separate ventilation system, the thick vault-style hinges, the security mechanisms built into the floor that could only have been designed by someone with military or engineering training. Everything was deliberate. Everything had meaning. For the first time, a creeping awareness seeped into her. Someone, somewhere, might still be looking for what Elias had protected. Or worse, someone might already know she was here. Fear threatened to rise, but she pushed it down. Fear had guided too many years of her life. Down here, in this vault carved from secrecy and sacrifice, she needed clarity. A lesson surfaced in her mind, not one written by Elias, but one born from her own scars. Sometimes the things left behind for us aren't gifts, they're responsibilities. And sometimes responsibilities feel like traps until you learn why you were chosen for them. She reached for another box, this time larger, heavier, locked with a brass mechanism. As she ran her hand over it, she felt a strange certainty coil inside her. Whatever was inside this box wasn't treasure. It was truth. The kind of truth governments bury, the kind of truth families forget, the kind of truth Elias had died to protect. And before she opened it, before she dared see what he had hidden from the world, she knew she had to step back and breathe. Not because she was afraid, but because something in her understood that crossing this threshold meant she could never return to the life she had known, not even the broken version of it. When she finally emerged from the chamber, her children watched her quietly. Noah hugged her waist. Lily took her hand. Grace searched her mother's eyes, trying to read the storm gathering behind them. "Mom," Grace said softly, "are we safe?" Mara knelt and pulled her close. "We are, but everything's about to change." And it would, far more than she could imagine. For most of her life, Mara had believed that America's darkest secrets lived far above her, locked in military archives, buried beneath classified labels, guarded by men and women whose names the public would never learn. She never imagined one of those secrets would be sitting on a metal table in a forgotten mountain bunker, or that it would involve her family. Yet, as she flipped through the first pages of the EAR-17 dossier, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the sensation of stepping into history, not the kind written in textbooks, but the kind erased before ink ever touched paper. The program's outline was clinical, almost sterile in tone. EAR-17, Emergency Asset Relocation, established 1962, classified Level 4. But buried beneath that cold language was a story born from the paranoia of the Cold War, the same era that taught American schoolchildren to hide under desks and convinced families to dig fallout shelters in their backyards. EAR-17 wasn't listed among the well-known continuity of government plans. It wasn't Mount Weather or the Raven Rock facility or the bunkers built under luxury hotels where congressmen would be whisked away during a nuclear strike. EAR-17 was something else entirely, something improvisational, something desperate. The documents revealed a truth that chilled her. The government had created secret asset caches across the country. Gold, bonds, foreign currency, and critical documents intended to rebuild the American economy if the unthinkable happened. But instead of assigning trained officials or military personnel to guard these caches, they chose people like Elias Crichton, people on the margins, people who didn't trust the government enough to stand in the spotlight, but trusted it just enough to be used in silence, people who could disappear without raising alarm, civilian custodians, chosen not because they were loyal, but because they were invisible. One memo, dated 1964, spelled it out with disturbing bluntness. Custodians must be individuals unlikely to attract attention or scrutiny, with minimal community ties and high tolerance for isolation. Psychological resilience preferred, but not mandatory. Mara felt her stomach twist. Not mandatory. like her relatives' mental stability, had been optional, disposable. She read further, her eyes catching phrases that felt heavier with every page, subjects selected for their anonymity, operational secrecy contingent upon personal isolation, custodian deaths to be reported only if recovery protocols are required. The files didn't hide their meaning. These were human shields, chosen to carry a burden the government never intended to acknowledge. They were to live quietly, guard quietly, and die quietly. It explained so much. The loneliness in Elias's journals, the airtight bunker, the map markings, the gold, the bonds, the foreign asset notes, and above all, his final message. They trusted me once. They should not have. Grace leaned closer as Mara read aloud a paragraph describing how the program dissolved in the late 70s after internal scandals. Funds were supposedly retrieved, sites decommissioned, custodians informed. But the language was vague, too vague. It didn't state whether the retrieval ever actually happened. It didn't mention what happened to Elias. And it certainly didn't explain why the entire program had been scrubbed from history, no public records, no whistleblower testimony, no declassified files, nothing. If EAR-17 had been swallowed by the past, it was because those in power wanted it buried deeper than any bunker. The more she pieced together, the clearer the picture became. Elias hadn't been guarding treasure. He had been guarding leverage the government needed desperately in the event of collapse, and leverage they now wanted erased, quietly and completely. Her hands trembled as she flipped to the final section, a roster of custodian names. There were only 19. Beside each name were cryptic notes, status updates, mental health evaluations, site coordinates. Some were marked recovered, some decommissioned. A few simply said unconfirmed. Elias's name was there too. Beside his status, instead of an official note, someone had scribbled by hand. Off-grid, no response, continue to monitor. Suddenly, she understood. He hadn't disappeared voluntarily. He'd become a liability. And liabilities are dangerous to those who want their mistakes forgotten. She closed the folder, breath shaky. Noah and Lily wondered why she looked pale. Grace had turned quiet, her eyes dark with a kind of knowing no 12-year-old should ever have to carry. They all felt it. The room itself seemed to tighten, as if the chamber's secrets were rearranging the very air. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Grace whispered, "Mom, do they know he died? Do they know we're here?" Mara couldn't answer. The truth, the terrifying, unspoken truth, was that she had no idea who still monitored EAR-17. She didn't know if the government had abandoned this place or if someone, somewhere, kept a quiet eye on every custodian site, waiting for signs of disturbance. And she didn't know whether their arrival had already tripped some forgotten wire. But she did know this. Secrets this large don't stay buried forever. A lesson crystallized inside her, one forged from the weight of every hardship she'd lived through. Power isn't just held by those in charge. It's held by those who carry the stories nobody else wants to tell. Elias carried one. Now she carried it too. And that responsibility, unwanted, unexpected, unimaginable, came with consequences. She stood, clutching the folder to her chest, her heart pounding with equal parts fear and determination. The bunker suddenly didn't feel as safe as before. It felt watched, exposed, like a chessboard where she had unknowingly been placed in check. And she knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. Soon, someone would come looking, not for her, but for what she had discovered. What she didn't yet realize was that the first knock on that door would come sooner than she imagined. And when it did, it would shatter the fragile peace she had built underground. For a few days, Mara convinced herself that maybe, just maybe, no one would come. That maybe the bunker, the vault, the secrets, the gold, the bonds, the classified files, maybe all of it had been forgotten by the world above. The government was big, after all. America's history was full of abandoned projects, failed experiments, broken promises. Why would anyone care about a forgotten custodian who died quietly in the mountains decades ago? Why would anyone be watching her? But deep down, in that instinctive place where mothers sense danger before it arrives, she knew the silence wouldn't last. Secrets like EAR-17 didn't just disappear. They hovered. They waited. And when disturbed, they sent ripples through the world the way a stone disturbs a still pond. She felt those ripples long before she saw them. It began with a sound, a subtle hum in the distance as she and Grace hiked down the mountain road to gather firewood. Not the rumble of a truck, not the whine of a dirt bike. This sound was lower, heavier, like an engine built for work, not travel. When the dark SUV rounded the bend, its windows blackened, its plates unreadable, Mara froze. Every instinct screamed hide. She pulled Grace behind a fallen tree, pressing her hand over her daughter's mouth, begging her with her eyes not to move, not to breathe. The SUV slowed as it passed, too slow, as if smelling the air, as if listening for something beneath the wind. Only when it disappeared down the road did Mara's lungs release the breath they'd been holding hostage. "Mom," Grace whispered, "that wasn't a regular car." "I know," she murmured. "I know." They returned to the bunker with urgency, the quiet of the forest, now feeling sharper, like every branch and leaf was watching them. For the rest of that day, Mara's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She double-checked the hatch locks, then triple-checked them. The world underground no longer felt like a sanctuary, more like a hiding place in a game where she didn't know the rules and wasn't sure she wanted to. That evening, she made the mistake that cracked everything open. She took one of the bearer bonds, a lower value one, just a test piece, and drove into Raven Ridge to ask discreet questions at a small pawn shop. The shop owner, a wiry man with tired eyes, examined the paper carefully, too carefully. His expression didn't match his words. "Where did you get this?" "Oh, my grandfather's things," she lied. "That so?" The man's eyes flicked toward a corner where a camera should have been, but wasn't. A blank circle sat where the lens used to be. "These are rare, government issued, old, dangerous to carry around." "Dangerous?" His voice dropped. "If I were you, I'd pretend you never saw this, and I'd leave. Right now." She did. But the damage was done. She sensed it even before she stepped outside into the pale winter light. That subtle shift in the air when someone's attention lands on you. She didn't see the second man in the diner across the street, watching through the window. She didn't see the third man in the parked truck. She's only noticed the first sign of danger when she pulled onto the main road and spotted the same black SUV from earlier, taillights glowing, waiting for her. She didn't go home, not yet. She drove in a wide loop around the town, past fields of frost-covered grass and collapsing barns. But no matter how many turns she made, no matter how far she tried to outrun that feeling, the SUV appeared again, and again, always at a distance, always watching. It wasn't until she reached the final turn toward the mountain road that she realized the truth. They were hurting her, not chasing, hurting. The moment she parked outside the cabin, she told the kids to pack their things quietly. Lily clutched her stuffed rabbit, tears filling her eyes, without fully understanding. Noah kept asking if they did something wrong. Grace was silent, her jaw clenched. Before they could descend the ladder, a voice called out from the trees, "Miss Ellison!" Mara spun, heart slamming against her ribs. 3 men stepped from the shadows, dressed in dark coats that looked official without having any actual identifying badges. That was the most terrifying detail of all. We need to ask you a few questions," the tallest one said. His tone was cordial, almost polite, but his eyes were ice. "No," she said, gripping the ladder. "Without a warrant, you don't." One of them smiled, not kindly. "This isn't a criminal matter, Miss Ellison. It's a national security issue. We believe you're in possession of materials that don't belong to you." Her voice trembled. "I don't know what you're talking about." "We think you do." Another stepped forward, blocking her path. "Your relative, Elias Crichton, was part of a discontinued federal program. Some of the program's property was never recovered. We're here for that property. You have no right to threaten my family." "We're not threatening," the tall one said softly. "We're offering you an opportunity to cooperate before this becomes complicated." The implication hung in the air like a blade. Her children stood frozen on the cabin steps, their faces pale with fear. When the men's eyes flicked toward them, even briefly, Mara felt something primal ignite inside her, a mother's fury, a survivor's instinct, a line that she would never allow them to cross. "You're not coming in," she said firmly. The smile faded from the man's face. "Then you're making a dangerous choice." "No." Her voice cracked. "I'm making the right one." She descended the ladder and slammed the hatch shut just as the men stepped forward. The wheel lock screamed as she turned it, metal grinding against metal. For a moment, she thought she heard the thud of a fist on the hatch. Then, silence. Her breathing was ragged, her body trembling, her children huddled around her, shaking just as hard. It was then, in that suffocating moment deep underground, that she learned one of the hardest lessons of her life. Sometimes, danger doesn't come from the world that breaks you. It comes from the world that claims to protect you. She had crossed a line, and so had they. The government hadn't just seen her. They had marked her. And once marked, no one gets left alone. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have predicted, was that Elias had built more than a bunker. He had built a contingency, a way out. And that contingency was about to become the only reason Mara and her children survived what came next. The bunker had never felt smaller than in the moments after those men walked away. Every breath of recycled air tasted like danger. Every hum of the generator felt too loud, like a signal giving away their location. Mara sat with her back against the steel door, her children huddled around her, their faces pale and frightened in the dim light. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, steady, urgent, warning her that this was no longer about secrets in the wall or gold buried underground. This was about survival, not someday. Now, for the first time since arriving, she wished the bunker were deeper, darker, hidden beneath miles of stone. But no bunker, no matter how well built, could protect her from a system designed to erase people like Elias or silence people like her. And as she looked at her children, trembling but trusting, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to think. The government wasn't just after the assets. They were after control. Control of the story, control of the truth, control of anyone who stumbled into their forgotten sins. She couldn't stay, and she couldn't wait. So she moved. The plan formed in her mind with a clarity born from desperation. Before the men could return with reinforcements, she gathered the most important documents, the EAR-17 files, Elias's journals, the code roster, and just enough financial assets to keep them alive if they needed to disappear permanently. She wrapped everything in plastic, then tucked the bundles into her backpack. The gold bars and the rest of the vault's contents would stay behind, buried beneath steel and silence. Let the men dig for it, let them claw through the concrete. She would take what could expose them and leave the rest as bait. "Pack your things," she whispered. "We're leaving." Noah started crying softly. Lily clutched her stuffed rabbit so tightly its seams strained. Grace didn't cry. She just nodded, her eyes burning with a fierce kind of loyalty. "I'll help." They moved quickly, quietly. Mara knew they couldn't use the main hatch. If the men had sensors or motion detection set up, the second that wheel turned, they'd come running. But Elias had built more than one exit. Buried deep in his notes was a sketch of a narrow escape tunnel, 40 yards long, barely tall enough to crawl through, sealed by a rusted hatch concealed beneath a false rock at the tree line. She found it behind the canned goods in the storage room, a metal grate bolted into the floor. When she pulled it up, cold air rushed in from below. A ladder descended into darkness. It felt like dropping into a grave. But graves, she reminded herself, were not for the living. They climbed down one by one. The tunnel was suffocating, the air stale and metallic. Their knees scraped against the dirt, their elbows bruised against the rocks. Noah whimpered, but Grace whispered to him, steady and calm, reminding him that they were brave, that Mom knew what she was doing, that this wasn't running. It was choosing to live. When they reached the end, Mara pushed up the small hatch. It stuck at first, then gave way with a soft crack, leaves tumbling inside. The forest above was silent. Too silent. She lifted each child out, scanning for movement between the trees, for the glint of a rifle or the shape of a man in a dark coat. But the night was still. Only the wind moved. She didn't waste a second. They ran. Branches slapped their faces. Pine needles cracked beneath their shoes. The cold bit into their skin like teeth. The mountain terrain was unforgiving, each step threatening to twist an ankle or send them tumbling down the slope. Yet Mara kept going, driven by the primal truth that had guided mothers since the beginning of time. They might catch me, but they will not take my children. By the time they reached the old logging road, their breaths came in ragged gasps and their legs shook. But Mara recognized where they were. A half-mile down the hill was a cabin belonging to Henry and Ruth Callahan, the elderly couple who had, weeks earlier, given her hot tea and blankets when they found her, and the kids stranded near the town line, the last good people she had met in a world that seemed increasingly full of shadows. Light flickered through the Callahan's window as she approached. She knocked only once before Henry opened the door, his warm, lined face tense with concern the moment he saw her. "My God, Mara, What happened? No time, she whispered. Please, we just need a place to stay until morning. Henry didn't ask another question. He ushered them inside, bolted the door, and stoked the fire. Ruth wrapped the children in quilts, held them close, whispered prayers over their trembling bodies. Mara stood in the corner of the room, her face buried in her hands, shaking with a mixture of shock and gratitude. That night, she barely slept. Every crack of wood, every gust of wind against the windows felt like footsteps approaching. She knew the men would search. She knew the SUV would return. She knew the government didn't knock politely twice. By dawn, she had made up her mind. Running would only buy them moments. Hiding would only delay the inevitable. If she wanted to keep her children safe, truly safe, she needed something stronger than fear, something the government couldn't erase or intimidate into silence. She needed the law. With Henry's old laptop and a spotty internet connection, Mara began searching for legal aid groups that specialized in government overreach. She found stories, horrifying ones, about asset seizures gone wrong, mistaken identities, whistleblowers threatened into submission. But she also found something else: lawyers who fought those battles, lawyers who won. She sent an email to one name that appeared again and again in the success stories: Clara Reddington, a civil liberties attorney known for taking on cases others were too afraid to touch. Within hours, Clara called. "Mara," she said, her voice crisp but warm. "I've read your message. I need you to listen closely. You have something they want. And that puts you in danger, but it also gives you leverage." Leverage, a word that tasted like oxygen. Clara instructed her to come to the city immediately, to bring the documents, to hand nothing over to anyone else, to speak to no one, to trust no stranger on the road. So Mara did. She loaded the kids into Henry's truck, thanked the couple with tears streaming down her face, and drove away from the mountain, the bunker disappearing behind them like a ghost swallowed by the trees. As they approached Denver, Clara's office stood tall among the glass buildings, a stark contrast to the cold earth of the bunker. Inside, Clara listened as Mara unfolded the story. Every file, every bond, every detail of the pursuit. And when she finished, the attorney sat back, tapping a pen against her notebook. "This," Clara said slowly, "is not just a case. It's history the government tried to bury, and they won't let it go easily." "But what can we do?" Mara whispered. Clara leaned forward. "We fight, in the open, because once something is in the public record, they lose the power to erase you." And in that moment, Mara understood something she had never realized before. Running protects you for a day. Standing protects you for a lifetime. Her fear didn't vanish, but it transformed. It became resolve. Resolve that carried her into the legal battle of her life. Resolve that would expose decades of secrecy. Resolve that would turn a hunted mother into a defender of truth. The first weeks of the legal battle felt like drowning in slow motion. Mara spent her days in conference rooms that smelled of recycled air and old carpet, her nights in a small rented apartment provided by a victim support fund. Everything was temporary. Her safety, her income, her home, and yet everything was immediate, urgent, loaded like a spring. Clara worked tirelessly, building a case from documents that were never meant to see daylight, each page a crack in a wall the government had spent half a century fortifying. The children tried to adjust to a new school, but fear trailed them like a shadow. Noah jerked awake at night, crying about men at the door. Lily asked if they would have to live underground again. And Grace watched her mother with a seriousness far too old for her 12 years, as if she understood that every decision being made could alter the fate of their lives forever. The government responded predictably at first. Denials, technical language, veiled threats wrapped in politeness. But when Clara filed the motion to expose EEAR-17 as an unconstitutional covert program, everything changed. Letters arrived from agencies Mara had never heard of. Requests for sealed hearings appeared with alarming speed. A man in a Navy suit lingered near the apartment lobby, too often to be coincidence. And Mara felt the weight of unseen eyes, not only watching, but calculating. One gray morning, Clara walked into the meeting room with a folder under her arm and a look that Mara had never seen before, part anger, part disbelief. She sat across from her, folded her hands, and spoke carefully. "They want to settle." Mara blinked. "Settle? Already? Does that mean we won?" Clara shook her head. "No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means they're scared." Inside the folder was a proposal from a federal entity whose name was redacted so aggressively it looked like a void on paper. The offer was simple on the surface. Return the vault contents. Return the documents. Return anything related to EAR-17. In exchange, no charges, no custody challenges, no criminal allegations, and silence, permanent, non-negotiable, legally binding silence. But the most chilling line wasn't in bold or italics. It was written in neutral bureaucratic language, almost polite. Failure to cooperate may result in additional investigations into matters of public concern, including parental suitability. They didn't need to say it. Mara felt the meaning seep into her bones like poison. "Give up the truth, or risk losing your children." She pushed the papers away as if they burned her. "They can't do this." Clara's jaw tightened. "They can, and they have. They're counting on your fear." Fear. The same fear she had tasted in the bunker, in the parking lot, on the mountain. Fear had followed her for months, shapeless and crawling. But this fear, this was different. This fear had names, signatures, and seals. This fear came with consequences she couldn't outrun or hide from. Hours later, they met with the officials in a repurposed federal facility, an old Cold War research building tucked behind barbed wire and frostbitten pines. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a cold detachment, as if they refused to witness what was about to unfold. 3 government representatives sat at the table. No uniforms, no name tags, just blank eyes and expensive suits. The oldest among them spoke first. "Ms. Ellison, we appreciate your cooperation in this matter. We understand this situation has been overwhelming." Clara cut him off. "We're not here for gratitude. We're here for transparency." A thin smile. Calculating. Transparency is rarely beneficial in matters of national stability. Mara's hands tightened on the table. "He was my family. He died alone because of your program." "Mr. Creighton volunteered," the man replied calmly. "He wasn't informed," Clara shot back. "He wasn't monitored. He wasn't supported. He was abandoned." The man's smile faded. "The program was discontinued decades ago. You're asking us to account for decisions made during a period of global instability?" "History," Clara said, "does not erase accountability." Silence hung between them like a noose. Finally, the man slid a second folder forward, the real offer. This one was worse, sharper, more intimate in its cruelty. They would allow Mara to keep a portion of the assets, $30 million, carefully allocated and quietly documented. Enough to build a life, but not enough to threaten them. Enough to appear generous, but not enough to expose wrongdoing. In exchange, she would surrender everything else, every file, every map, every journal, every truth. And she would sign a protection agreement disguised as a whistleblower safeguard, but written in a way that ensured she could never speak of EAR-17 again, not to the media, not to friends, not to her children, especially not to her children. Mara felt her chest tighten, her breath thinning. She looked at the page, but all she could see were her kids asleep on the Callahans' couch, their cheeks pink from the fire, their small hands curled in exhaustion. She saw Lily's trembling lip, Noah's nightmares, Grace's fierce, frightened bravery, and she understood. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a choice designed to break her, give up the truth, or give up her children's future. Clara whispered, "You don't have to do this." But Mara knew she did, because some battles aren't won by exposing the truth. Some battles are won by protecting the people you love from the consequences of it. Her voice shook as she spoke. "I'll sign." The officials nodded with quiet satisfaction, as if confirming a result they had calculated long before she walked into the room. But Mara didn't sign because they intimidated her. She signed because she had learned something essential in the darkest moments of her life. Survival isn't about winning every war. It's about choosing which ones are worth dying for. The moment the pen touched the paper, something in her broke. Yes, but something else hardened, clarified, strengthened. She didn't walk out defeated. She walked out determined. Determined to build a life for her children that no bunker, no program, no hidden chamber could ever take from them again. The settlement did not feel like victory. It felt like the quiet after a storm, a moment of stillness where the world stops spinning, not because everything is fixed, but because there is finally room to breathe. For the first time in months, Mara walked out of a federal building without looking over her shoulder. No black SUVs, no men in dark coats, no stern voices telling her what she could or couldn't say. Just an open sidewalk, a cloudy sky, and 3 children waiting for her outside in the back seat of Henry's truck, bundled in oversized hoodies, watching her with anxious eyes that softened the moment she stepped into view. She smiled, a real one this time, small, tired, but real. That evening, back at the Callahans' cabin, the family shared a meal around a wooden table worn from years of use. Simple food, stew, bread, apples, but it tasted like a feast after everything they had endured. Ruth held Mara's hands across the table and said softly, "You're safe now, dear." And though Mara didn't fully believe it, she nodded. Because safety, she realized, isn't always a physical state. Sometimes it's the feeling of having people who care enough to sit with you in your brokenness even when they don't know how to fix it. Winter melted slowly into spring. The mountain thawed, revealing patches of green and sunlight that stretched longer each day. And Mara, with quiet purpose, began building something new, not from wealth alone, but from a sense of responsibility that had grown inside her like a seed planted in darkness, now finally able to bloom. The first step was rebuilding the cabin on Elias's land. She hired local contractors, people who knew the mountain, people who didn't ask too many questions, but understood hardship when they saw it. She turned the cabin from a collapsing shelter into a warm, sturdy home with wide windows that let sunlight spill across the floors. She filled it with mismatched thrift store furniture, children's drawings, and soft blankets. She didn't try to make it perfect. She tried to make it theirs. Then she returned to the bunker, not with fear, but with intention. She sealed the forbidden room with concrete and steel, making sure no one could ever access what she had surrendered. The outer rooms she cleared out, cleaned, and repurposed into storage, safety, and practicality. And the generator, ventilation, and supplies were restored, not out of paranoia, but out of respect for what Elias had built, a place meant to protect life, not hoard secrets. She kept the parts of the bunker that belonged to survival. She buried the parts that belonged to history. But her renewal didn't end with herself. Something in her had changed permanently. Something that refused to let her walk past other struggling families, knowing she now had the power to help. So she created a fund, a simple one at first, a small, community-focused project meant to provide emergency housing stipends for single parents, especially mothers, who found themselves one paycheck or one tragedy away from sleeping in their cars. She called it the Creighton Fund, not to honor the government's program, but to reclaim the name of the man who had been twisted into a tool and died in silence. In reclaiming his name, she reclaimed his humanity. Word spread quietly through nearby towns, first through whispered conversations at school, then through church bulletins, then through local volunteers who had seen too many families fall through the cracks of a broken system. And slowly, almost unexpectedly, Mara found herself surrounded by people who didn't look at her with pity, but with gratitude, respect, recognition. One woman, a mother of two escaping an abusive marriage, cried in Mara's arms after receiving temporary housing support. "I don't know why you're doing this," she said, "but thank you." Mara held her tighter, "because someone once helped me, and because no one should ever feel as alone as I did." Her children healed too, in their own ways. Lily began talking in full, animated stories again, filling the cabin with laughter. Noah thrived in his new school, drawing pictures of mountains, trucks, and brave explorers. Grace worked with a quiet sense of purpose, helping Mara organize donations and sorting supplies for families arriving with nothing but backpacks and frightened eyes. Together, they built not just a home, but a sanctuary. And as the seasons continued their slow, ancient cycle, something inside Mara softened. What had once been trauma became wisdom. What had once been fear became resilience. What had once been a life torn apart became a foundation strong enough to build upon. She wrote in her journal one night while the children slept, the fire crackling softly beside her, "I didn't win, not in the way people think winning looks. But I kept my children. I reclaimed my life. And I learned that survival is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new one." Her words weren't meant for the public. They weren't meant to expose secrets or reopen old wounds. They were meant for the woman she used to be, the one who slept in the minivan, terrified and exhausted, believing she had nothing left. The one who didn't yet know she would discover strength inside herself that no government, no program, no dark past could ever take away. Mara closed the journal, looked out at the moonlit forest, and let the quiet settle around her like a promise that she had rebuilt her life from the ruins, piece by piece, breath by breath. A promise that the worst thing that ever happened to her would not define her children's future. A promise that her story, painful as it was, had been transformed into something powerful enough to guide others out of their own darkness. And in that quiet, she whispered the final truth she had learned. You don't have to rise from the ashes alone, but you do have to choose to rise. And with that, the chapter closes, not with fear, but with hope, not with secrets, but with healing, not with darkness, but with a life rebuilt in the open light of a new beginning. If you believe every mother deserves a second chance, share this story.